Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Katrin Benholt. I'm a correspondent for the New York Times, and I'll be chairing this afternoon's controversial lecture. Apropos controversial, I remember a few years back when I was in Algeria covering a story, and I was working with this fixer called Jihad. And I was meeting Jihad in this cafe, and he was late, and I was sort of getting nervous. Eventually, he shows up. I'm sitting in the back of the cafe. He doesn't quite see me. I wave at him frantically, and when he doesn't see me, I shout, "Jihad!" And that didn't go down so well. But joking aside, we do live in a strange modern era of medieval barbarism. Islamic militants have been beheading Western journalists. They've been executing Christians, murdering Pakistani school children, kidnapping and raping hundreds of Nigerian girls and women. They gunned down cartoonists in Paris and tourists in Tunisia. Recently, they took Ramadi and Palmyra, leaving in their wake yet more severed heads and potentially the destruction of some of the world's most beautiful and precious ruins. So all of this has raised a rather uncomfortable question, and not just in the West. And this question is there something in Islam that is somehow inherently more violent than in other religions? In the words of one prominent Egyptian atheist, Ahmed Hakan, what has ISIS done that Muhammad did not do? Well, the man to answer this question in the next 30 minutes or so is here with us today, Tom Holland, historian, multiple author, and no stranger to controversy.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Thank you, Katrin. And of course, the question you ask, is Islam in some way more violent than other religions, is one that Christopher Hitchens, in whose name this lecture is being given, engaged with. It's a huge honor to be giving this. I never had the pleasure of watching the great man, but I've read him, watched him, listened to him, and hugely admired the wit, the courage, the brio, and yes, the relish for controversy that he brought to almost everything he said. And when Peter Florence asked me to give this talk, the one thing he asked me to ensure that it would be controversial. So here goes. Now, the topic was, of course, suggested for me by the title of probably Hitchens' most famous book, God is Not Great. And in relation to the question that you asked, there is some footage on YouTube of Hitchens being asked by a Sufi Muslim, why had he chosen God is Not Great as the title for his book? Why the negation of Allahu Akbar, the Arabic phrase meaning God is great? And Hitchens turns round, and as was his way, responds without taking any prisoners whatsoever. And his answer is, the most toxic form that religion takes is the Islamic form. Bang. He does go on to qualify this. He does say that there were other religions at other times that had been equally as bad, and he, of course, name-checks his other favorite bugaboo, the Catholic Church. But nevertheless, I think that were Christopher Hitchens still alive today, I doubt that he would have changed his mind about Islam. Since the end of 2011, when he died, we have seen the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq draw on scripture to justify maimings, beheadings, slavery, and genocide. We have seen cartoonists murdered in Paris on a charge of insulting Muhammad. And of course, we have the persistent and steady drumbeat in the back of our heads of Islamist plots constantly being foiled. And I read in the newspaper yesterday that the most senior Muslim officer in the Met reports that they are arresting terror suspects at a rate of 1 a day. And he says that children as young as 5 are being, in his term, radicalized. So I suspect that were Christopher Hitchens in front of you now, he would not be pulling his punches. Islam, I'm sure he would say, remains the religion that is most incompatible with all that he held dear. Now, of course, the great thing about Christopher Hitchens was that he was nothing if not an enthusiast for free speech. And what he said when he declared that Islam was the most intolerant, the most violent form of religion, I think it retains not just for Muslims, but for liberals too, the kind of Hay Festival visiting liberal. I think it has the quality slightly of blasphemy. Because the possibility that sanction might exist within the inheritance of Islamic scripture for the brutal crimes committed by the Islamic State or by the Charlie Hebdo murderers is a really appalling one for decent and generous-hearted people, non-Muslim as well as Muslim, to countenance. And it's that, I'm sure, that explains whenever there is some jihadi atrocity, politicians and commentators rush to pose as experts on Islam and insist that the perpetrators are either twisting or distorting Islam, or in certain cases they will go so far as to say that they are not Muslim at all. An example of this was provided by John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, when he was commenting on the Islamic State earlier this year. And he said that the Islamic State claims to be fighting on behalf of Islam, but the fact is that its hateful ideology has nothing to do with Islam. Nothing to do with Islam. And this essentially is the presumption that underlines our own government's entire de-radicalization policy. I think the very phrase de-radicalization is telling and benefits from some unpicking, because what it does is to imply that there is a normative, authentic, echt Islam, one that embodies ideals that are perfectly compatible with liberal, secular Britain, and then there are misinterpretations of it, distortions of it, that are not really Islam at all. And I entirely understand why people do that. It's done for the best of motives. However, I think that it has become not merely counterproductive, but seriously problematic. And the reason for that is that by denying the title of Muslims to, say, Islamic State, Western governments are actually playing the same lethal game as the Islamic State themselves. Because what the Islamic State do is to condemn other Muslims as either apostates or heretics, the better then to justify their elimination. And I really don't think it is for prime ministers or home secretaries to play that game. Because once you take it on yourself to define what is and isn't authentic Islam, then you are buying into the notion that such a thing as authentic Islam actually exists. Now, if you're a believer, of course, that's fine. You will accept that indeed Islam was given to you by God, and therefore it does have some absolute Platonic essence. But if you're not a believer, then a religion is just like any other manifestation of human culture. It's something that is porous, variable, forever mutating and evolving. It's a dialogue between people in the present and an inheritance of texts and traditions. And people can choose what of those texts and traditions they wish to emphasize. So it's not like a religion is the equivalent of a radio station set on a bar. You can definitely find it. It's far more, it's a whole series of points on a bandwidth. And obviously the definition of what an extremist is, what a radical is, will depend where you stand on that bandwidth. Because it cannot be emphasized too much that, of course, jihadists do not think of themselves as extremists. To them, it's us, the comfortably secular and liberal kind of people who I suspect form the vast majority of the crowds at the Hay Literary Festival, who are the extremists. Jihadis see themselves as models of righteous behavior. They see themselves as doing God's will, as expressed in the pages of his holy book, the Quran, and the sayings of his prophet, Muhammad. And they also see themselves as obedient to something else, to the example of Muhammad. The Quran is absolutely explicit about this. In the messenger of God, it says, you have a beautiful example, an example to follow. And so it does matter then to jihadis no less than to the vast majority of Muslims who would never in a million years set about destroying the antiquities of the Near East or taking sex slaves or murdering those who mock the Prophet, that sanction for what they do is indeed to be found within the various biographies and traditions that are associated with the Prophet. And I think that to close our eyes to this and to imagine that what Western governments characterize as Islamic extremism owes nothing to the example of the Prophet is willfully blind. When beheading an infidel seems to have been enshrined as something that every jihadi now aspires to do, it's surely not entirely irrelevant that Muhammad himself owned a sword that can be translated as the cleaver of vertebrae. Why try to de-radicalize jihadis without also trying to de-radicalize the Prophet who, as the beautiful example set before them by God, is bound to serve them as their surest inspiration and role model? To do so, I think, is essentially to put a sticking plaster over a deeply buried thorn. Now, it would be disingenuous of me to pretend that I don't know the answer to this question. The one thing that every non-Muslim who, say, 30 years ago probably knew very little about Islam, but the one thing that all non-Muslims have learned over the past 30-odd years is that to question the moral perfection of Muhammad is basically akin to poking a hornet's nest with a stick. It's telling that all the notorious clashes between Western notions of freedom of speech and Islamic fundamentalism seem to have revolved around the figure of the Prophet, be it the Satanic Verses, the Danish cartoons, Charlie Hebdo. It seems, ironically, that actually you are likelier to provoke grief and pain and anger among Muslims by insulting the Prophet of God than God himself. And as a result of this, the sense has developed that even to talk about Muhammad is somehow off limits to non-Muslims. And the consequence of this, and the reason that I'm sure Christopher Hitchens would be appalled at the fact that this hasn't altered, is that essentially an unspoken blasphemy taboo has taken hold in the West. And because of that, the inspiration that jihadis are clearly drawing from Muhammad's example, no matter in how directly, it exists as a context for their actions. That inspiration remains largely unexamined. And the consequences of this, I think, are very, very pernicious. On the one hand, the claims that, say, the Islamic State themselves are trumpeting go unexamined, that when they bulldoze Assyrian antiquities, or, God help us, maybe Romano-Greco antiquities, what they're saying, essentially, their justification is that they are inspired by Muhammad's destruction of idols in the Kaaba in Mecca when he took Mecca at the end of his career. Or that, say, when they take Yazidi girls as slaves, that they are emulating his relations with Maria, the Coptic slave girl who served Muhammad as his concubine. But at the same time, and at the opposite ideological end of the spectrum, not examining these claims leaves the field free for those who are determined to put the most hostile spin on Muhammad's life, because the image of him as a violent warlord determined to execute Jews and to order the assassination of his critics is not exclusive to jihadis. It's one that lies at the heart of polemics against Islam as well, and these fester on the internet just as much as jihadi propaganda does. And so the consequence is that between those who claim the sanction of Muhammad's example for their violence and those who claim that violence and Islam are synonymous, there actually exists a sort of weird and unholy alliance. both the jihadis and those who regard Islam as synonymous with violence, from the opposite ends of their ideological spectrum, share the same basic presumption that the truth about Muhammad's life and career can be known, and that they have arrived at that truth. Now, in fact, there are, and there always have been, as many versions of Muhammad as there are varieties of Islam. If we think about the most obvious split in Islam, that between the Sunnis and the Shia, it's essentially a disagreement about Muhammad's posthumous intentions. And so you see reflected in that huge seismic split, there are many, many others. And it reflects the fact that his biography has never been something stable. It's always been evolving. And in that sense, I suppose the battle for the soul of Islam is also a battle to define the prophet. Jihadis cannot possibly be de-radicalized unless Muhammad is de-radicalized as well. And I think that this is a project that non-Muslims certainly have a role to play. I think that this is not of purely academic interest, because it sort of explains why we have to take our shoes off when we go on airplanes and all kinds of things. It does impact us. But of course, it's not exclusive to us. And the ultimate wellsprings for reclaiming Muhammad from the jihadis must exist, and do, I think, exist within Islam and Islamic scholarship. And if they don't, then we are essentially all doomed. Because unless Islam can draw sustenance from its own traditions to purge itself of what is going on in its name, then really there's very little hope. Now, essentially, the problem, I think, that Muslims in the West particularly face is this. And it's what to do with traditions about Muhammad that are incompatible with the mainstream values of a liberal, secular democracy such as Britain is today. And this issue has been rendered particularly pressing by the phenomenal rate of ethical and moral change that has overtaken the West over the past 30, 40 years, and which is evident, for instance, in the vote in previously solidly Catholic Ireland to legalize gay marriage. I think this is a problem for all religions. It's clearly a problem for Christians, but I think it is particularly a problem for Muslims. Peter asked me to be controversial, so let me give you the most pressing and obvious example of this. Now, as recently as the 1970s, biographers of Muhammad, non-Muslim as well as Muslim, do not actually seem to have been unduly worried by the proposition that an older man might sleep with a younger girl. In 1970, Glubb Pasha, as John Glubb was known, he was the head of the Jordanian armed forces. He was British, then retired and wrote biography of Muhammad. And in it, he detailed all the sort of the various circumstances of Muhammad's life, including, of course, his marriages. And he focused on one in particular, which was to Aisha, who was the daughter of Abu Bakr, one of Muhammad's earliest followers, who would go on to become the first caliph after Muhammad's death. And Glubb, in his book, was able to report very precise details about Aisha's age when she married Muhammad, because these details were recorded by Bukhari, who was the most authoritative compiler of the sayings and the details of Muhammad's life. And Bukhari says that Aisha narrated that the Prophet married her when she was a girl of 6, and he consummated the marriage when she was a girl of 9. And Glubb, in his book, he doesn't raise an eyebrow at this. He seems to have found it all rather sweet. He says, when Aisha was married, she brought her toys with her to her room in the Apostle's house. Charming. And Glubb is not alone in having seen all this as rather charming. In fact, no one before him, all the way back through the early modern period, right the way back through the Middle Ages, seems to have had any problem at all with the fact that Aisha should have married Muhammad at such a young age. Now, of course, since Glubb wrote that in 1970, there has been an absolute sea change in attitudes. As many a disgraced 70s celebrity could attest, attitudes towards underage sex have hardened very, very significantly. I would go so far as to say that it is now, in a sense, the ultimate taboo. It is the ultimate crime. And Muslims living in the West, of course, are not immune to this change in moral attitudes, not least because the charge that Muhammad was a paedophile has become a staple of anti-Islamic polemic online. It festers there. Aisha was 9 when she lost her virginity to Muhammad, who at the time, according to traditional biography, was 54. And so obviously this has become a difficult, controversial, even painful issue for many Muslims. How do you respond to this? One course, of course, is to say, well, Muhammad slept with a 9-year-old, therefore it's fine to sleep with 9-year-olds. And that is the course that certainly the Islamic State, when they take Yazidi girls, have been following. However, most Muslims have not taken that course, and so instead they have had to come up with alternative strategies. One strategy has been to relativize the marriage, to say that back in the 7th century, customs were different, that it was the habit for girls to marry at a much younger age, and also fascinatingly adopting what was a sort of a trope of Orientalist European writers. They said that in the hot climate of Arabia, young girls matured much more early. But of course, relativizing what Muhammad did, placing it in either a geographical or a historical context, is setting boundaries on the degree to which Muhammad can be considered a model for all time. So many Muslims have adopted an alternative strategy, which is to question the reliability of the source, to question Bukhari. How do we know that what Bukhari tells us is true? Because Bukhari is writing it over 200 years after Muhammad lived, and it's dependent on a whole chain of people reporting this information. And so in a sense, it's a process of Chinese whispers. And so perhaps Muslim scholars argue now the reliability of this information is to be doubted. Now, I happen, as a historian, to think they're absolutely right. I don't think that any of the sayings attributed to Muhammad are really very reliable. I don't trust sayings that are reported 200 years after on the say-so of various unreliable witnesses. But while it has essentially become the orthodoxy among non-Muslim historians to doubt the reliability of these sayings as evidence for the historical Muhammad, what's intriguing and possibly momentous about this process is that for the first time, really, mainstream Muslim scholars are starting to do the same. And of course, when they do that, in effect, what is happening is that they are tugging on the thread of an enormously ornate and complex carpet. And you tug on one thread, and you risk having the whole lot unravel. Because in fact, Bukhari, as I said, is held to be the most reliable collector of hadiths, of these sayings that are attributed to Muhammad and his various followers. So if you can discard the hadith that reports that Aisha was 6 when she married Muhammad and 9 when she first slept with him, on the grounds that it's morally unacceptable, then why, one might ask, can you not do that with other hadiths? Hadiths that, for instance, mandate stoning for adultery, or the death penalty for apostates or homosexuals, or the obligation on women to shroud themselves. Why not, in short, finesse everything away in the Prophet's biography that offends against contemporary standards? Now, does that mean that everything has to go? Because, of course, once you relativize Muhammad, or once you start questioning the historical basis for what we know about him, then, of course, there is the risk that much that seems solid melts and dissolves. But I don't think that this does mean that Muhammad vanishes. I think it just means interpreting the material of Muhammad's life in a different way. Because the literal manner in which most people, non-Muslims as well as Muslims, read the details of Muhammad's biography is not really true to the spirit in which it was originally written. Those who recorded these details did not have as their primary focus a concern to transcribe historical fact in the way that biographers today would. They were after profounder truths. Why did Bukhari specify that Aisha was 9 when Muhammad first slept with her? We can't know if that is true, if that is true. And it's not just the distance of time, but because Aisha's marriage is a deeply political one. The circumstances of Islam's birth, in a sense, revolved around what happened when Muhammad died. I mentioned the Sunni-Shia split. It really revolves around whether Abu Bakr was justified in becoming the caliph. And Abu Bakr, of course, was Aisha's father. So by saying that Aisha was pledged to Muhammad so early that she no possibility of her ever having any relationship with any other man, what Bukhari, as a loyal Sunni, someone who accepted Abu Bakr's status as the first of the righteously guided caliphs, was doing, was emphasizing not biographical reality, not Muhammad's sexual tastes, nothing like that, but something much profounder. He was emphasizing the symbolic potency that Aisha has as a figure within Sunni Islam. And I think that 200, even 100 years ago, most Muslims would instinctively have understood this. And that sort of prompts the question, well, what has changed? Why is it now understood so literally? And I think that essentially what's happened is that Islam has been weathered and transformed over the past century or so by the same forces that have served to secularize the Western Christian world. Keisha Ali, the great scholar of the life of Muhammad, has written that texts written symbolically came to be read literally. And I think that that is the nub of the change and therefore of the problem. Because in the Middle Ages, even into the early modern period, it was less the historical facts of Muhammad's life that concerned most Muslims than, his role as the intercessor with God on the Day of Judgment, his status as God's beloved, his spiritual beauty as a ruby among stones. But since the colonial era, when European standards started to influence the way that Muslims understood their own past, the influence of Western biographical presumptions has profoundly transformed the way that Muslims understand their prophet. Two obvious ways, I guess, to focus on. The first is the way in which he's essentially being reconfigured in 19th century style as a great man. So whenever Muslims praise him as a genius, as a supreme social reformer, as a great nation builder, what they're doing is portraying the influence of essentially Victorian standards. In fact, I think there's a sense in which Muhammad, along with, interestingly, Alexander the Great, another sort of great conqueror of the Middle East, I think that those two figures really are in a sense, the last redoubt in the 21st century of the great man school of history, which otherwise has really gone into eclipse. But I think the influence of Western methodologies has been even profounder. Because the project of attempting to place Muhammad in his historical context and to make sense of his life, not as a mystical expression of God's purpose, but as an episode of human history, this process began, of course, in the West. But for all that, its influence on the Muslim world has been incredibly profound. And the reason for that has been the presumption that's been gathering weight within Islam that the earlier the source, the more reliable it is. And this in turn has dovetailed with broader trends that are actually much older than the colonial period. In fact, they reach all the way back to the 13th century, to a scholar based in Damascus by the name of Ibn Taymiyyah, who proposed that the surest way to know God's purpose was to study the practices of the first 3 generations of Muslims, the forebears or salafs. And the reports of what Muhammad and his earliest followers had done, he argued, should always trump subsequent tradition. So like Luther, another great reformer, Ibn Taymiyyah was condemned as a heretic. But like Luther, he blazed a momentous trail. And today, Salafism, so people who look back to the example of the Salafs, the forebears, is probably the fastest growing Islamic movement in the world. And when people call for Islam to undergo a reformation, they ignore the fact that actually it's going through one right at the moment. The truth is that in Islam today, as in Christianity during the 16th and the 17th centuries, the spectrum of those who practice the faith is widening to convulsive effect. And essentially, it's the shocks of that we are all experiencing. And in this process, this widening of the understanding of Islam, the figure of Muhammad has a central and perhaps the central role to play. You've got the brutal literalism of the jihadis is critically dependent on its conceit that it has trampled down the weeds and the briars of tradition and has penetrated to the truth of the example that the Prophet provided. And you can see here, I think, the parallel with Protestantism in the 16th century, which likewise claimed that Protestants like Luther and Calvin claimed that they were going back to the original sources. They were going back to the original Gospels, to the examples of the apostles, that they did not need the vast inheritance of Catholic tradition, and indeed that inheritance of Catholic tradition obscured the truth. And that dovetailed with the development of printing, which meant that Bibles were readily available to people who did not have a clerical education in the church and were able just to read it. And I think the same process is happening now. I think it's incredibly telling that jihadism really began to take off at the same time as the internet took off. And I think that the internet is playing the role in what you could, I suppose, loosely call the Islamic Reformation, that the printing press took place in the Christian one. That what Muslims now, and often converts with no previous knowledge of Islam, can do now is to look up the Quran written in the vernacular anywhere on the internet. They can go to the vast assemblage of hadiths and biographies of Muhammad, and they can type in search words and they can look it up. And so it's absolutely true that Muslims who are going to Syria may well buy themselves Islam for Dummies, as some of them are reported to have done. But when people sneer at them for that, you're mimicking the sneering of Catholic prelates who mocked tinkers and tailors for taking up Protestantism. So how are we to contest this process, this sort of violently literalist approach, this determination to see Muhammad's life and example as the equivalent of an engineering manual? The idea that because Muhammad ordered the assassination of critics, therefore Muslims today have the right to do that. Well, I think that both Islamic and non-Islamic traditions have their part to play. I've mentioned the great heritage of medieval Islam, and particularly the great mystical traditions, with their emphasis on the cosmic role of Muhammad. I think that that's a critically underutilized resource. And were it to be developed and rediscovered and recaptured and revitalized, it would have a transformative effect, not just on Islam, but on Islam's relationship with the non-Islamic world. But I think that non-Muslim scholarship, too, can help. And I think its role in understanding, in shaping how we understand Muhammad remains an incredibly vibrant and exciting one. Over the past 40 years, again, and I keep coming back to this notion of 40 years, I think that when historians look back, they will see that this has been an incredibly seismic period in all kinds of ways in the relations between Islam and the non-Islamic world. But over the past 40 years, Western-style scholarship has revolutionized the understanding of Muhammad's life. And it's a very sort of piquant irony that the Salafist impulse to strip away the cladding of tradition and return to an understanding of Islam's beginnings that doesn't depend upon subsequent accretions and distortions to the historical record has had a very close parallel in Western universities, where Salafists strip away all this cladding and identify the sort of the radiant light of historical certainty, though, Western scholars find the opposite. They find that actually there's almost nothing there. Indeed, the consensus now, I think, probably among most scholars who study early Islam, would be that we know less about the historical Muhammad than we do about the historical Jesus. And I think that if we look at the way in which Christian traditions and biblical traditions were historicized over the past 200 years, we can see that the inexorable process of historicizing Islam is bound over the long term. We were talking decades or centuries here, but it is bound to have an impact upon the literalism with which many Muslims today are tempted to interpret their scriptures and their understanding of their prophet. When the evidence for what the historical Muhammad said and did is so patchy, I think that it becomes increasingly difficult to insist that the inheritance of writings about him is not thoroughly contingent. At the moment, the notion that Muslim beliefs are as historically conditioned as any other ideology inherited from the past is seen by most Muslims as highly threatening. But I think in the long run, this is bound to change. And recognizing that the stories told about Muhammad and the sayings attributed to him are fictions bred of a particular context and period should facilitate the emergence over the next century of a clearly Western form of Islam. And it is one I hope and trust that Christopher Hitchens would no longer have found so toxic. Thank you. Let me stay here.
Thank you, Tom. I think the applause said it all. It was a truly thought-provoking presentation, and dare I say, controversial. I should think Peter will be happy. You said beforehand that you were quite nervous. How are you feeling?
I feel fine.
Good.
I'm feeling relieved. Although I haven't had the questions yet, so time will tell.
Let me start by asking a couple of questions, but I'll throw it open fairly quickly. We've got sort of 22 minutes left, and do get thinking. I want to start with a sort of gentle pushback and perhaps stating the obvious, but of course, our own Christian history and scripture is full of violence. Beheadings and burning people on stake, we've been there. From the book of Joshua to the book of Revelation to Jesus himself, who, according to Matthew, the gospel writer, said, "I come not to bring peace, but the sword." There's plenty of material to weave together a very extremist and violent narrative. Is this exceptionalism that you ascribe to Islam really fair, just because we're looking at a very brief period in history here?
Well, it has become a rule that when you discuss Islam in any way negatively, you immediately have to talk about how awful Christianity is as well. So if you talk about jihad, you immediately have to say, yes, but crusades. So that's why I deliberately left parallels with Christianity out. But since you ask, you are right, of course, that both Christianity and Islam have been so influential and so enduring because they offer an immense range of material for people. So there is a pacifist tradition within Islam, as in within Christianity, and there is a bellicose tradition likewise. I think that what has happened in Christianity over the past century, really, is that Christians have come to terms with the more pernicious elements within Christian tradition and have excised them on the theological level. And I think that there are two obvious examples of that. The first is the strain of anti-Semitism, which was inherited from the Gospels and which burst into full horrific flower with the Holocaust. And in the wake of the Holocaust, Christians on the theological level reversed their opinion that the Jews had been cursed for rejecting Christ. The second example, I think, which is probably the closest analogy to the Muslim doctrine of jihad, is enshrined in the book of Joshua, the conquest of the promised land, promised to the children of Israel by God, and therefore the children of Israel are entitled to nick it from the Canaanites. And this provided European colonists, particularly Protestant European colonists, with all the justification they needed for nicking vast swathes of the various continents outside Europe for their own ends. So it provided justification for the Puritans in North America. It obviously provided justification for the Dutch settlers and then later the British settlers in South Africa. And there's a sense in which that tradition, again, was being used right up until the end of the apartheid era. And what happened when apartheid ended was that it was ended not just in the name of African nationalism, but in the name of Christian ethics and morals and values. And people like Archbishop Tutu turned the claim of the apartheid biblical justifiers of apartheid against them. And I suspect that certainly European Christians will never use that justification again. So I think that in a sense, is what Islam needs to do as well. It needs to look at elements within its ideology that are clearly incompatible with the best of the values that Islam enshrines and to purge itself of them. And I think that one of the things that the horrors that are being conducted by the Islamic State at the moment is doing is showing just how horrific the consequences can be of following through certain aspects of Quranic commandment or the example of Muhammad's life in a completely literal sense.
Although what I would say as a journalist who's been sort of studying this from a very different angle, like, interviewing people on the ground, former jihadis and people who are toying with the idea of extremism, my sense is that theology comes into it almost, it's kind of a thing that comes into it at some stage. But the first and possibly most important thing that I take away from my interviews is grievance. So there is a sort of sense of collective humiliation among Arabs and Muslims in general, that they haven't been in charge of their own destiny for the last 200 years, that they've been run by colonial powers and then the hapless regimes left over by them. And that collective humiliation then meets the sort of individual frustration, sometimes in the West, experiencing racism or discrimination, and is sort of amplified by a steady stream, a daily stream of horrific images of dead Muslim children from Syria to Gaza to Burma. And it's that sense of deep grievance, to me, that drives the extremism or creates that fertile ground. The theology, to me, doesn't seem as central as you make it sound.
Well, I think that the role of religion often seems to me that it amplifies characteristics that are within people. So if you are a good, decent person, then the effect of religion, be it Christianity or Islam or Judaism or whatever, is to amplify what is good within you. I think likewise, if you have violent impulses, then it can amplify them in turn. I absolutely agree with you that the people who are shelf stackers in High Wycombe who are going out to Syria are not motivated by a profound understanding of Islamic theology. But I think that they may well be motivated by a sense that they are in a dead-end job, and they feel that they are given somehow a God-ordained entitlement to go out and to kill people and to have sex slaves and then go to heaven. What's not to like?
But what's different in that to a sort of counterculture? I mean, what I see sort of on the streets in East London is girls in university fancying the brothers who pray. Beards are sexy. Islam is punk rock. There's that sort of counterculture that we've seen through the ages. My father was in the student sort of movement in the 60s in Germany. There's something there that that is quite sort of separate from theology.
I mean, you know, the sex appeal of the bearded jihadi who carries with him the sort of erotic charge of violence, that is ultimately deriving from the jihadi's understanding of who Muhammad was.
So who, and this is my last question, and then I'll open it up, who do you think is the authority in the sort of Muslim world that needs to drive this reformation forward? In other words, who has the authority today? Is it a sort of a panel of scholars in Saudi Arabia? And on that note, why hasn't Saudi Arabia condemned in the clearest terms the literalist interpretation of ISIS of the life of Muhammad?
Because the Islamic State and Saudi Arabia are singing from the same hymn sheet. They both embody Salafist strains and traditions. I mean, they're ultimately, I mean, all that the Islamic State is doing is pushing what Saudi Arabia do to a kind of reductio ad absurdum. I've forgotten what the.
So where is this credibility? Who has the credibility?
Oh yes, of course.
Yeah.
Well, no one does. I mean, it's always pointed out that there's no equivalent of a pope in Islam. But I think if we look at again, looking at the analogy with Christianity, which of course is what we always seem to come back to doing, I think that what is happening in the Muslim world, and specifically in Syria and Iraq, is essentially the equivalent of the 30 Years' War in your own country, which was a horrendous process of slaughter where people ended up forgetting why they were killing each other. There was the vague sense that it began with the sense that they were fighting for religious ideals, but the slaughter was so horrific and the carnage so disgusting that ultimately people just ended up exhausted. And the long-term consequence of that was to breed the framework of tolerance and enlightenment that would enable a Locke and a Voltaire to emerge. Now, I don't know when they will emerge in the Arab world, but I suspect that they are out there, or at least their parents or grandparents are out there. It can't be top down. It cannot, you cannot convene a group of scholars from Al-Azhar to draw it up, because obviously, as we were saying, the kind of people that we're talking about aren't going to care about them. But in the context of the Middle East and the suffering that people in the Middle East are going through, I cannot believe that people will emerge from the carnage that is happening at the moment and say that Islam is necessarily the answer. And we have to remember that part of the chilling effect of this is that this apostasy ruling, the notion that people who turn against Islam, who reject it, who cease to believe in it, should be killed. I mean, that is something that, of course, it would inhibit me.
That's interesting.
If I was told, standing up here, I will be killed, I probably wouldn't be giving this talk.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
That's that I think, if Muslims can feel that a 54-year-old man sleeping with a 9-year-old is wrong, then I think that they can also feel that killing apostates is wrong as well, and changes can be made to the understanding of what Islam and Muhammad is about that would reflect that.
Let me get some questions from the audience. We have some roving mics. Here we go. Yes.
Hello. I just want to say, personally, I think any opposition to cartoonists drawing prophets is quite a desecration, and to suggest that Mohammed and Jesus never had a penis, and that the fact that the sign of nudity, is just because it's just a question on their impurity and divinity. I think it's quite good for people to be questioning such things. I was also saying, is it really that Islam is more violent, or is it because we, being a British culture, is Christianity is ours, so we're happy to deconstruct it, criticize it, and the fact that we've not challenged people who have Islam is that fact that because we've embedded that we're not allowed to criticize or challenge Muslim, that they believe that it shouldn't be challenged, and we've created that.
Sorry, where are you? I couldn't see you.
Just here.
Okay. I'm sure that's true. I think, in a sense, modern atheism in the West it's Christian atheism. And secularism and liberalism are shot through with Christian ethical and moral presumptions and understandings. And as a result of that, it's kind of like children criticizing parents. you feel fine criticizing your own ancestors. You feel fine. It is easier to criticize one's own religion, one's own culture, because you're aware, of course, that Muslims in Britain and across the West are a minority, and they're often a minority that suffers suspicion. And I think that the impulse not to criticize Islam is a good one and reflects well on mainstream society. But I just think that we have reached the stage now where things are turning so septic in Islam that people who are not Muslim should not feel inhibited in questioning aspects of Islam that are clearly contributing towards things that are perhaps less than ideal.
I think there was a gentleman over here. Oh, sorry. Right.
Hello.
Right.
Yes, okay. I was struck by two things in particular. One, your comparison with the Reformation, and secondly, by the way that you got onto the question about authority within Islam at the end. To me, it's a bit as if in the 16th century, the radical reformers had benefited from the destruction of the papacy and the acquisition of the gold and silver mines in South America, in that Islam no longer has the authority of a caliphate since 1924, and Salafism and Wahhabism are funded from some of the richest reserves of capital in the world in Saudi Arabia. Reactions to that?
Yeah, well, I think that, of course, there are a whole stream of explanations, and the geopolitical one is a crucial part of it. But that is one that foreign policy experts are happy to analyze, and the economic influence of particularly Saudi Arabia on developing Wahhabi strains of Islam in mosques across the West has been very closely pursued and identified. The reason that I focused on Muhammad and the figure of Muhammad is that I think that in general there is an anxiety about discussing that, and that there is a feeling that that has been off limits and that we shouldn't discuss it, and the pretense should be that Muhammad is in every way a figure who is utterly compatible with Western liberalism, and that essentially is what I'm focusing on here. But I'm not in any way saying that the geopolitical context and the sort of the economic imperatives are irrelevant. I'm not saying that, but just for the purposes of this speech, that's what I focused on.
Got the gentleman over here.
Hello. The picture that we come across when we listen to jihadists, and also when we read about what Orientalists have written of Muhammad, is really quite unattractive. Can you give us some thoughts from a historical point of view and from your view as a historian, as why you think in the early decades people were attracted to Muhammad and why it took off?
Well, I think that we don't really know what people thought of Muhammad in the early decades of Islam, because we have very few Muslim writings about Muhammad until around AD 800 that have survived. And then suddenly you have a vast glut of material. You have biographies, you have collections of his sayings. I think that the life of Muhammad, as it has been canonized in the various biographical materials and the hadith collections, reflects impulses that have very little to do with the actual life of the historical Muhammad. I think that the collections of his sayings are a way in which the various elements of Jewish or Zoroastrian or Christian or Roman or Persian law could be fragmented and then introduced into the bloodstream of the emerging religion that would become Islam. Because what the various converts who brought their own cultural traditions would do would be to say, yes, this is the tradition, but actually Muhammad said it. So, for instance, the classic example is in the Quran, the penalty for adultery is that you get whipped, but we all know that in the hadiths, the penalty is that you get stoned for it. And the reason for that is that stoning is the penalty that is prescribed in the Torah. So you can see there the trace elements of Jewish converts, rabbinical converts probably, to Islam, who are bringing this tradition and they integrate it into the bloodstream of Islam by applying it to Muhammad at a specific place and a specific time. So if something gets attributed to Muhammad, then it's, I shouldn't say kosher, halal.
Yeah.
I also think that the life of Muhammad is constructed to explain the fact that the Quran is absolutely rife with contradictions. Is Islam a religion of peace? Is it a religion of war? Well, it's both. But what the people who constructed the life of Muhammad did was to come up with the notion of abrogation, which was that the earlier verses in the Quran, as they were revealed to Muhammad, were then abrogated by the later ones. And the people who constructed Muhammad's life were scholars who were going off to fight the Romans on the frontier. And so they wanted to provide a justification for what they were doing. And so therefore, they emphasized the more bellicose verses in the Quran over the more pacific ones. So as a result, the life of Muhammad was constructed to ensure that the bellicose verses would have precedence, would abrogate the lesser ones. And the closest parallel that I can think of from English history is what people have always been tempted to do with the life of Shakespeare. We have the plays, we have the sonnets, they have seemed to many people to be touched by the Spirit of God, but we know almost nothing about Shakespeare. And so the temptation has always been to look at the sonnets or to look at the plays and to extract biographical information and fashion a life of Shakespeare in that way. And Muslim biographers, I think, did the same with the Quran. They looked and they saw that whoever the author of it was very animated about equal rights for orphans, and so they said, well, obviously Muhammad was an orphan. There's a passage in which someone hides in a cave, and so they said, well, obviously Muhammad hid in a cave. I do not think that the Quran is to be explained by the life of Muhammad. I think it's the other way around.
One last question over here, please.
So in the newspaper this morning, Lord Dennett was quoted as saying that the only solution to the problem of ISIS was for Western governments to put boots on the ground in Iraq. I'm somebody who opposed the second Iraq war, but nonetheless I can sort of understand and to some extent sympathize with people who take that view because the slaughter which we're witnessing is so horrible. Your analysis would seem to suggest that all we actually can do is stand to one side, wait for the 30 Years' War to play out. We will have to watch a lot of misery and slaughter, blood being spilt, people being raped over many years, and eventually this process will come to an end. What do you think? Is that right?
Well, I mean, in response to the problems of the Middle East, we've tried intervening, and that was a disaster, and we've tried not intervening, and that was a disaster as well. And I mean, no one can watch the suffering of the Syrian people, the Iraqi people, the Yazidis, the Christians, the Shia, who have come under the heel of ISIS and not feel a sense of despair and a desire to do something about it. As someone who writes about Roman history, ancient history, I contemplate the destruction of Palmyra with horror. Of course, I would love to see something done. However, I think that for outsiders to intervene in what is going on is akin to putting your hand into a Magimix. Nothing good can come of it. And I think that the analogy with the 30 Years' War is a good one because what happened there was that outside powers would intervene, the Swedes, the French, whoever, and it only contributed to making it worse. So I don't know what we do. Maybe we just have to do nothing. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible situation. That's a cheery note on which to end, sorry.
I wonder what they were saying in the Ottoman Empire when this 30-year war was going on. Those Christians over there, they really need to sort themselves out, you know? They need a reformation. Thank you very much, Tom Holland. I thought it was a brilliant contribution to the debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.